What happens when a civilization loses not just its buildings or borders, but its memory? Not the memory carried in monuments or maps, but the quieter kind, the kind folded into pages, whispered between generations, hidden in diagrams, formulas, and stories that once helped people make sense of the world. History usually tells us that knowledge disappears in fire, in war, in flood, in the ordinary violence of time. But there is another possibility, more intimate and more unsettling, that some things are not lost by accident. They are taken. Again and again, across centuries, we find the same haunting image. A library in the half-light, shelves breathing dust, a door forced open in the name of empire, faith, progress, preservation. Men arrive claiming to protect truth and leave carrying boxes. What vanishes is not only parchment or ink. It is a way of seeing, a method of healing, a map of the stars, a version of the past that might have changed the future. This is not a story about easy certainties. It is a story about patterns, about the fragile relationship between power and knowledge, and the strange fear institutions have often shown toward ideas that arrive too early, or from the wrong people, or in forms they cannot control. Some of these accounts live on as fragments, some as allegations, some as official history with its edges worn smooth. Yet together they point toward a familiar human impulse. When knowledge threatens authority, authority rarely greets it with gratitude. So we begin here, in the silence after removal, in the empty space on a shelf where something once rested, in the long echo left behind when a culture's most valuable questions are packed into crates and carried out of sight. And as we step into these vanished archives, one question remains in the air like dust in a shaft of light. If the greatest discoveries were not destroyed, but hidden, what kind of world have we inherited? And what kind of world might have been possible if more of humanity had been allowed to remember? It began, as many losses do, with a city that believed knowledge could outlast kings. In the ancient world, Alexandria was more than a port on the Mediterranean. It was an audacious idea made of stone and papyrus, a place where scholars imagined that if every text could be gathered, compared, translated, and preserved, then human understanding itself might become a kind of lighthouse. Ships entered the harbor from distant coasts carrying spices, metals, myths, and manuscripts. Scribes copied what they found. Translators bent over foreign alphabets. Philosophers argued beneath open colonnades, while physicians, astronomers, and mathematicians tried to place order on a world that still felt immeasurably large. In that setting, a library was not storage, it was an engine. It turned curiosity into continuity. And yet the dream of preserving everything carried its own shadow. To collect knowledge in one place is also to make it vulnerable in one place. Fires, wars, decrees, neglect. History offers several explanations for how Alexandria's great collections were diminished. Some losses were likely sudden. Others may have happened slowly, shelf by shelf, regime by regime, as priorities changed and institutions weakened. What was taken, what was burned, what was simply allowed to disappear, those distinctions blur across time. Still, the cultural wound remains vivid because the library stands for more than one building. It stands for all the unwritten futures contained in vanished pages. Medical observations that might have traveled farther, star charts that might have shortened centuries of uncertainty, plays, philosophies, and local histories whose absence quietly reshaped what later generations believed the ancient world had been. When we picture Alexandria now, we often imagine flames. But perhaps the truer image is quieter. Rooms once alive with debate growing still, scroll cases left open, a civilization discovering too late that memory can be mortal. And so the question deepens. When a library falls, do we lose facts alone? Or do we lose entire ways of imagining what human beings are capable of becoming? What if some of the most important knowledge in history was not erased but absorbed, carried away under the banner of conquest and reborn under another name? In the ancient world, victory was never only about land. It was also about inheritance. Armies moved through cities, but so did scribes, collectors, priests, and advisors who understood that ideas could be as valuable as gold. When kingdoms fell, their archives often became spoils. Clay tablets, astronomical records, medicinal recipes, engineering notes, sacred commentaries, these did not always vanish in a blaze. Sometimes they were cataloged, translated, and folded into the intellectual wealth of the conqueror. On paper, this could look like preservation, and sometimes it was, but preservation under power is rarely neutral. Once knowledge is removed from the people who created it, its meaning can change, its origin can soften, its context can evaporate. We see this pattern across empires. A civilization studies the heavens for ritual and agriculture. A later empire inherits the data and repackages it as state science. A healer's tradition rooted in one landscape is copied elsewhere, stripped of ceremony and treated as universal technique. The transfer may advance learning, yet it can also erase authorship. History remembers the palace where the text was stored, but forgets the village where the idea was born. This is one of the quieter thefts of the past. Not destruction, but displacement. Not silence, but ventriloquism. The knowledge survives, yet the people who shaped it slowly disappear from the official story. What remains is a polished lineage that flatters power and shortens memory. Perhaps that is why the lost archive continues to trouble us. It reminds us that knowledge does not only die in darkness, it can also survive in altered form, carrying the fingerprints of those who claim to save it. And that leaves us with an uneasy question. When we celebrate the inheritance of civilization, whose voices are we truly hearing, and whose have been carefully edited out? In the highlands of Mesoamerica, before conquest redrew the moral map of the world, knowledge was painted rather than bound. It lived on bark paper codices, in folded screens of color and symbol, where astronomy, ritual, history, agriculture, and time itself were woven together into a single vision. To modernize these surviving fragments can seem decorative, almost dreamlike. But to the civilizations that made them, they were instruments of orientation, ways of locating human life within the turning order of the cosmos. Then came the collision of worlds. Missionaries and colonial officials looked upon these manuscripts and often saw not knowledge but threat. What they could not easily translate, they condemned. What they could not fit into European categories of truth, they treated as error, idolatry, or danger. And so countless codices were burned, confiscated, or broken apart. The destruction was not only material, it was interpretive. An entire intellectual system was pushed towards silence because it did not resemble the forms authority was prepared to recognize. Only a handful survived. From those few remnants, scholars have glimpsed calendars of astonishing precision, careful records of dynasties and ceremonies, and sophisticated attempts to understand cycles of nature, power, and sacred time. What vanished alongside them may have included histories written from within indigenous experience rather than from the outside gaze of empire. Not only facts were lost, but voice, proportion, and self-understanding. There is something especially heartbreaking about this kind of erasure. A library burns and we mourn the flames. But when a culture's texts are destroyed because they are judged unworthy of being texts at all, the wound runs deeper. It tells us that ignorance is not always passive. Sometimes it is organized, justified, and carried out with absolute conviction. And standing before the small number of codices that remain, fragile as leaves after a storm, we are left with a difficult thought. How much of human wisdom has been dismissed? Not because it lacked value, but because power lacked the humility to read it. Picture a desert wind moving across ruined stone, touching walls that once guarded one of the ancient world's most enigmatic treasuries. In the cities of Mesopotamia, knowledge was pressed into clay. Small tablets marked with wedges, dried beneath the sun, then stacked in archives that linked palace, temple, and sky. They recorded trade and law, certainly, but they also held omens, star positions, flood cycles, medical treatments, in the fragile effort to turn uncertainty into pattern. For the Assyrians and Babylonians, observation was rarely separate from meaning. A planet's movement could be both a celestial fact and a political sign. An eclipse was not merely an event to chart, but a disturbance to interpret. To modern readers, this blend of astronomy, divination, and statecraft can feel unfamiliar. Yet within it was something unmistakably scientific. Disciplined watching, repeated notation, the patient accumulation of data across generations. Even mystery here had method. When empires rose and fell, many of these tablets were scattered, buried, broken, or taken into the collections of later powers. Some survived by accident, protected by the same fires that destroyed the buildings around them by hardening the clay. Others disappeared into private hands, early excavations, imperial museums, and the long shadow world of removed antiquities. What endured was extraordinary. What vanished may have been even more so. Among the surviving records are clues that ancient Mesopotamian scholars tracked the heavens with a sophistication that still surprises modern historians. But beyond the technical achievement lies another truth. These archives reveal a civilization wrestling with vulnerability. Drought, war, disease, and cosmic uncertainty pressed against daily life, and people answered not with resignation, but with record-keeping. They wrote because the world was unstable. They observed because memory might become a form of shelter. And perhaps that is why these lost tablets still speak to us. They suggest that knowledge begins not in certainty, but in exposure, in the quiet human refusal to look away from the unknown, even when the unknown is looking back. What if the most dangerous idea in history was not a weapon, but a remedy? Across the ancient world, medical knowledge rarely belonged to a single person. It moved through temples, households, apprenticeships, and fragile manuscripts. It was copied by hand, revised through practice, and carried across borders by traders, physicians, and wandering scholars. Healing, like memory, depended on transmission. In Egypt, Greece, India, China, and the Islamic world, medicine developed through different languages of the body. Some traditions emphasize balance, others anatomy, others energy, diet, surgery, or the relation between human health and the wider environment. These systems did not always agree, yet each represented centuries of observation. Pain noted, herbs tested, fractures set, fevers watched, patterns remembered. Long before modern laboratories, there were already disciplined communities trying to understand suffering without surrendering to it. And still, medical texts have often been especially vulnerable to theft, suppression, or selective preservation. A conqueror may seize them for practical value. A court may guard them as privilege. A religious authority may distrust procedures that seem to trespass on sacred boundaries. Later ages may celebrate certain discoveries while forgetting the cultures that first articulated them. In that way, healing knowledge can survive while its lineage disappears, absorbed into a cleaner story of progress. There is an irony here that history seldom states plainly. The same civilizations capable of preserving medical wisdom were also capable of hoarding it. Treatments could become restricted. Manuscripts could be hidden in elite collections. Translation could rescue a text while quietly erasing its. The result was not always loss in the dramatic sense. Sometimes it was unequal access, knowledge remaining alive, but no longer shared as widely as human need required. To read the history of lost medicine is to encounter a profound moral tension. If a cure exists but is withheld, forgotten, or removed from the people who need it, is that preservation or a subtler kind of disappearance? And how many lives across the long corridor of time have depended on what one generation chose to protect and another chose not to pass on? It started with the stars, as so many human questions do. Before there were modern observatories or digital clocks, there were rooftops, temple towers, and open fields where people looked upward and tried to find order in the dark. Ancient sky watchers did not separate wonder from necessity. The heavens told them when to plant, when rivers might rise, when ceremonies should begin, and perhaps when a kingdom itself was entering dangerous weather. Across cultures, astronomical knowledge became one of the most carefully guarded forms of understanding. Priests, mathematicians, navigators, and court scholars recorded recurring patterns with astonishing patience. They tracked eclipses, planetary motions, solstices, and lunar cycles, building systems that tied celestial observation to earthly survival. To know the sky was to possess more than information. It was to hold a kind of temporal authority. The ability to anticipate what others experienced only as surprise. That authority made such knowledge valuable, and value made it vulnerable. Star charts were copied into royal archives. Calendrical systems were carried across borders through trade and conquest. In some places they were refined, in others restricted, and in still others dismissed as superstition by later observers who failed to see the precision hidden inside unfamiliar symbolism. What disappeared was not always the data itself. Often it was the intellectual framework that gave the data meaning. Even now, fragments of ancient astronomy continue to unsettle our assumptions about the past. Civilizations long described as mystical or primitive turn out to have measured the heavens with remarkable exactness. They did not know the universe as we know it, but they knew enough to build calendars, align monuments, and situate human life within cycles far larger than any single reign. Their genius was not modern in style, yet it was unmistakably real. Perhaps that is why the lost sky records still feel so poignant. They remind us that every civilization reads the cosmos in its own language, and every language reveals something about the people who speak it. When those records vanish, we lose more than observations. We lose a way of standing beneath the night and understanding ourselves as part of its design. What if a map could be dangerous? Not because it leads armies to treasure, but because it changes how a people imagine the world. In every age, geography has been more than measurement. It has been identity. To draw a coastline, to mark a river, to name a passage through mountains or sea, is to say something about who belongs where and who has the right to move. Ancient libraries often held more than books in the modern sense. They preserved routes, port records, traveler accounts, diagrams of distant lands, and practical knowledge gathered by merchants, sailors, and envoys. Some of these records were probably crude. Others may have been astonishingly precise for their time. Together, they formed a kind of spatial memory, a shared attempt to hold the known world in the mind, even as the horizon kept widening. When empires expanded, this knowledge became invaluable. A road is easier to control once it is recorded. A sea lane is easier to tax once it is understood. A frontier becomes easier to claim once it is named on paper. So maps and route texts were often copied, seized, or absorbed into imperial archives. Sometimes the transfer preserved them. Sometimes it severed them from the communities that first built those pathways through lived experience. The knowledge remained, but its ownership changed. There is a quiet tragedy in that process. The navigator who learned a current by listening to elders, the desert caravan master who read the land by wind and stone, the local chronicler who connected place with memory. These figures rarely survive in official histories as clearly as the courts in empires that inherited their insights. The map outlives the mapmaker and then pretends it drew itself. Yet even in fragments, old geographic knowledge reveals something timeless. Human beings have always wanted to cross distance without surrendering to it. We draw lines not only to possess the world, but to feel less alone within it. And perhaps that is the deeper mystery of every lost archive of maps. How many ways of knowing the earth have vanished? Not because they failed, but because a stronger hand redrew the page. Imagine a workship at dusk. Bronze glows in the last light. Water slips through channels cut with impossible care. A hidden weight drops. A wheel turns. A door opens by itself. To the people standing there, it might have felt like magic. But behind the wonder was something more enduring. The ancient conviction that nature's forces could be observed, guided, and transformed into useful motion. Long before the industrial age, inventors across the ancient world were experimenting with mechanics, hydraulics, optics, and automation. In Hellenistic cities, in Roman workshops, in Chinese courts, in the engineering traditions of the Islamic world, practical ingenuity took many forms. Devices lifted water, measured time, projected images, opened temple doors, and translated invisible principles into visible effects. Some were tools, some were spectacles, many were both. Yet technical knowledge has always lived on a fragile boundary between demonstration and disappearance. A machine may astonish a crowd, but unless its design is copied, taught, and maintained, the insight behind it can vanish with its maker. Libraries and court collections sometimes preserve descriptions of these devices, but such records were often scattered, incomplete, or lost when institutions fell. Even when texts survived, the materials, craftsmanship, and context required to rebuild the invention did not always travel with them. That is why so many early technologies seem to flicker in and out of history like distant signals. We find references to mechanisms that feel startlingly advanced, then discover that the chain of transmission was broken. Not because ancient people lacked intelligence or imagination, but because continuity itself is difficult. Knowledge does not move forward automatically. It must be renewed, reinterpreted, and kept in human hands. There is something humbling in that thought. Progress is not a straight ascent, it is a relay, and the baton is often dropped. A civilization may glimpse a possibility, then lose the conditions that made it real. So when we look at these half-remembered machines, we are not only admiring forgotten brilliance, we are confronting a deeper truth. How much of human potential has appeared before its time, only to wait in silence for another age to notice it again? What if the greatest thing ever taken from a library was not a machine or a medicine, but a memory of ourselves? Every civilization writes stories about where it came from. Some are carved into stone, some copied onto parchment, some carried in ritual, song, or law. These origin records do more than explain the past. They establish dignity. They tell a people who their ancestors were, what trials shaped them, and why their presence in the world matters. That is why the loss of historical texts cuts so deeply. When archives disappear, communities do not simply lose dates and names, they lose continuity. The thread between generations frays. Later powers step into the silence and begin narrating the vanished people for millennium, sometimes carelessly, sometimes deliberately, often with the confidence of those who control the surviving record. Over time, absence itself becomes a political force. We have seen this again and again. Conquered cities stripped of chronicles, royal lineages reduced to rumor, indigenous histories dismissed because they were preserved in forms unfamiliar to colonial eyes. Accounts of trade, migration, law, and belief removed from their custodians and reorganized inside foreign institutions. Even when fragments survive, they are often interpreted through borrowed frameworks, as though the past must first be translated into the language of power before it can be called real. And yet memory resists. It lingers in place names, in oral tradition, in ceremony, in the persistence of customs that outlive the books that once explained them. A lost archive does not always mean a lost people, but it does mean that future generations must work harder to recover what should never have been taken from them in the first place. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson hidden inside every missing chronicle. To control history is not only to shape what happened, it is to shape what later generations believe was possible, valuable, or true. And when a culture's memory is thinned out or stolen, the world grows narrower without always noticing it has become so. There is another kind of loss that history rarely dramatizes. No flames, no shattered doors, no soldiers carrying crates into the dark. Just a room closed, a manuscript untranslated, a shelf neglected for decades until the paper softens and the ink begins to fade. Sometimes knowledge is not stolen in a moment of violence. Sometimes it is simply left outside the circle of care. This may be the most human form of disappearance. Civilizations do not only destroy what they fear, they also overlook what they do not yet know how to value. A technical treatise seems obscure, so it is not copied. A local chronicle appears unimportant, so it remains in storage. A text written in an unfashionable language waits for a reader who never comes. In time, neglect accomplishes what censorship never had to. The silence deepens on its own. And yet neglect is never entirely innocent. Institutions make choices. Scholars follow prestige. Empires fund the preservation of some histories and not others. Entire fields of knowledge can drift toward obscurity because they sit too far from power, profit, or cultural fashion. When that happens, loss arrives disguised as routine. A budget is cut, a collection is moved, a fragile archive becomes an afterthought. No single person may intend erasure, but erasure still takes place. There is a particular sadness in this because it implicates more than conquerors or fanatics. It implicates ordinary priorities. It reminds us that forgetting can grow from convenience as easily as from cruelty. We protect what we believe reflects us. We neglect what asks us to become larger than we are. Maybe that is why abandoned archives feel so haunting. They do not only speak of the past, they mirror the present. They ask what forms of knowledge we are overlooking now because they seem marginal, difficult, or inconvenient. And in that question is a warning for every generation. The future will judge us not only by what we discovered, but by what we allowed to disappear while telling ourselves it could wait. And yet history is not only a record of loss, it is also a record of return. Again and again, what seemed gone forever has reemerged from caves, monasteries, sealed jars, desert ruins, shipwrecks, and forgotten storerooms. A fragment surfaces. A script is deciphered. A damaged folio is matched with another half preserved on another continent. Suddenly, a silence in the historical record begins to speak. These recoveries rarely restore a world in full. More often, they offer glimpses, partial but transformative. A few surviving lines can alter what we know about philosophy. A medical recipe can reveal an older lineage of experimentation. A map fragment can redraw the boundaries of contact between cultures. Discovery in these moments feels less like triumph than listening. The archive has not been rebuilt, but it has opened a narrow door. Modern technology has deepened that possibility in remarkable ways. Multispectral imaging can recover erased writing from damaged manuscripts. Digital reconstruction can reunite scattered collections whose original owners never imagined they would be dispersed across nations and museums. Scholars separated by language and distance can now collaborate across a single text, bringing back layers of meaning once buried beneath time and misinterpretation. Recovery has become both technical and moral, not only finding what survives, but asking who it belongs to and how it should be read. Still, every rediscovery arrives with humility. For each manuscript recovered, countless others remain missing. For every archive restored in part, an entire horizon of vanished thought stays beyond reach. The work of remembrance is therefore never complete. It is an ethic, not an ending. Perhaps that is the quiet grace inside this long story of stolen and scattered knowledge. Human beings continue to search. We continue to read broken lines, follow faint traces, and believe that fragments matter. Not because we expect to recover everything, but because every act of recovery widens the world again. And maybe that is what preservation has always meant at its deepest level. Not possession, but care. Not mastery over the past, but a promise to keep listening for what it still wants to say. So what, in the end, was really stolen from the libraries of the world? Not only scrolls, codices, tablets, diagrams, and charts, not only the craft of healers, the measurements of astronomers, the routes of navigators, the prototypes of inventors, or the chronicles of the conquered. What was stolen again and again was continuity, the fragile bridge that allows one generation to hand its hard-won understanding to the next without interruption, distortion, or fear. When that bridge breaks, the damage travels far beyond the moment of loss. Centuries later, we inherit gaps and call them inevitabilities. We assume that progress began where our records begin. We imagine that silence means absence when often it means removal. Whole peoples come to seem less curious, less skilled, less reflective than they truly were, simply because the evidence of their thought was burned, seized, untranslated, or filed away under someone else's name. In that sense, the theft of knowledge is never confined to the past. It keeps shaping the future. And yet these missing libraries offer more than sorrow. They offer perspective. They remind us that civilization is not built only by those who are remembered. It is also built by those whose names were carried off with the archives, those whose insights survived only in altered form, and those who kept fragments alive through memory when paper and stone failed them. Their absence presses on us, but so does their endurance. To stand before the idea of the lost library is to feel two emotions at once: grief for what vanished and gratitude for what still remains. A single surviving page can hold both. It tells us that forgetting is powerful but not complete, that even after conquest, neglect, and time, the human desire to understand the world continues to leave traces. And perhaps that is the chapter before the end, the moment when mystery turns inward. If so much was taken, hidden, or allowed to fade, then the question is no longer only what was lost. It is what kind of ancestors we intend to become for those who come after us. In the end, the story of stolen libraries is not really about objects. It is about the human struggle over meaning, over who gets to preserve the past, who gets to interpret it, and who is permitted to carry it forward. The missing scroll, the burned codex, the scattered tablet, the untranslated manuscript, each is a symbol of something larger. Together they remind us that knowledge is never merely accumulated. It is guarded, contested, neglected, revered, hidden, and sometimes returned. What survives from the ancient world survives unevenly. Some voices arrive to us in marble, in empire. Others come as ash, as rumor, as fragments rescued from the edge of oblivion. The imbalance matters. It shapes not only what we know, but how we imagine intelligence itself. We are tempted to believe that history naturally preserved the most important ideas. But history is not natural. It is selective, and selection has always been influenced by power, fear, accident, and desire. Still, this is not a counsel of despair. If the past teaches anything, it is that human curiosity is stubborn. It hides manuscripts in jars. It recopies damaged pages by candlelight. It carries oral memory across centuries when archives collapse. It returns to ruins with brushes and questions. It invents new tools to recover faint ink from old parchment. Again and again, people choose remembrance over surrender. Perhaps that is the clearest thread running through this long journey. Libraries can be looted, records can be scattered, the chain of transmission can break. But the longing to know, to piece together what was seen, thought, healed, measured, imagined, and loved before us remains one of the most enduring forces in human life. It is quieter than conquest, but stronger across time. So maybe the final question is not whether all lost knowledge can be recovered. It cannot. The deeper question is how we will live with that fact. Will we treat the past as a warehouse of curiosities, or as a conversation we are morally bound to continue with humility? Because every archive we protect, every forgotten voice we recover, every fragile memory we choose to keep alive becomes part of the answer. And somewhere, in every library still standing, that answer waits on the shelf like a light we have not fully learned to deserve.